A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're going to be talking about the power of friendship to make social impact. You might even have some thoughts on the foundations for your friendships and in light of the sorts of things we'll be talking about over this next hour, because we're turning our attention to some deeper perspectives on the power of friendship, and perhaps there are some deeper ways to talk about friendships in light of an appreciation of God and a biblical understanding of fellowship. Well, our special guest today has been reflecting on the word fellowship and the new and deeper dimensions we might consider in our own friendships. Dr. Dan Anderson says fellowship describes what we are, not just what we are doing. And he says we can enjoy deep, joyful security in the reign of Christ, even though there may be real battles and hardships that we may need to endure. The Reverend Dr. Dan Anderson is director of the Lachlan Macquarie Institute based in Canberra. He trains Christian men and women for wise leadership who are biblically faithful, culturally intelligent and positively engaged for the common good. Dan Anderson, I must say, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. It's great to be with you, mate.
Hey, Dan, reflect for us for a few moments here on friendships among believers. You know, I'm thinking shallow friendships, deeper friendships, friendships that might have a shortness and others that are, lifelong. How do you reflect on friendships among believers?
Well, I think you're right to say that there's lots of different kinds of relationships and friendships that we might find ourselves enjoying in the world. But when I think about friendships among believers, there are two places in Scripture that I like to think about. One is the friendship of David and Jonathan in the Old Testament, and many people would be familiar with that. In fact, when Jonathan dies, one of the most beautiful and gut-wrenching poems in all of Scripture is the prayer that David prays over the death of his fallen friend Jonathan. And one of the things that helps us to see is that there's a kind of tragedy to friendship in our lives at times, isn't it? It's not quite what we would like it to be. And most of all, it's not quite what we would like it to be, because sometimes it's ended by death and separation. So that's one thing to kind of keep in our minds. The other side of the picture, though, is the other great friendship in the Bible, which is the friendship of Jesus and Lazarus in John's Gospel. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but Lazarus is the only person, until Jesus speaks to his disciples this way, it's the only person that is described as Jesus' friend. And Jesus is able to rescue his friend from death. That says something really beautiful about the potential for friendships that we have as well.
And the outpouring of emotion at Lazarus's tomb, where Jesus wept. I mean, there was no holding back here. Even the Son of God just releases this wave of emotion because he realizes what death does, even to his own friend here. There's something special that it describes a depth of the emotion of friendship that we maybe don't always think about.
That's right. It shows us that it's something really deep and special, doesn't it? That the great king in the Old Testament, David, has this beautiful friendship. The great king of all time, Jesus, has this deep, special kind of friendship. And when Jesus comes to describe his own mission and his own life, he says it like this: greater love has no one than this, that he lays down his life for his friends. There's something special about friendship, isn't there?
There is. And, when we talk about lifelong friendships, sometimes they're friendships that we have right from our childhood or from our high school years or into our first job, and we connect with people and we stay friends. And my kids are grown up and now they've got some grandchildren. They're getting invited to birthday parties for the kids at grandchildren level. And I'm saying to my kids, hey, these are opportunities to actually connect with people and make friends at the adult level, not just the kids level. So these friendships, these can be formed either from our early years, but it's never too late, is it? What are your thoughts here on being too late to actually get the depth of friendship that we're going to be talking about today?
Well, there's two sides to that, isn't there? I think the saying is true that you can't make new old friends. There's something that comes with the history that you have with each other, and I feel that really deeply. Just this last year we went away with friends of ours that we made in our 20s. I'm now in my 40s, so those kind of 25-year-old friendships, there's something special about the depth of knowledge you have with each other. But you're also right to say that God surprises us at times by putting us in places with new people, and we discover a connection with each other that can become a friendship. And so we're always open. It's one of the things about the kind of love that friendship is. It's always open to growing and including new people. You kind of contrast that with marriage, right? Christian marriage is between two people. It's fixed at that number, whereas friendship is unlimited. It can keep growing and including new people.
What about the thought of conditional friendships? You're my friend if you do this or do that. And, there might be some even biblical references we can say about, turning your back on people who are doing evil. Then you might also argue that there's ways that you can keep that friendship and keep it unconditional, just a reflection of this unconditional love that we have in Christ. What are your thoughts on conditional friendships?
Well, that's a good one and a tricky one. I mean, one of the places you want to go to is Jesus himself, who says, "You are my friends if you do what I command." That's a conditional kind of statement there, isn't it, about friendship? So I think it's right to acknowledge that there are certain kinds of boundaries to the way that we can act towards each other. And if we break those boundaries, we're breaking the friendship. That's a real thing that we can do. But at the same time, the other side that we want to hold on to there is what we call faithfulness in friendship. And so Proverbs can say that there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. A brother is born for adversity, but a friend loves at all times. And there's a faithfulness, a sticking with each other in friendship that is part of what makes friendship special. And so we want to hold on to that as well, not be too quick to kind of break our friendships and to be unforgiving.
And the thought that from time to time, friendships can corrupt good character. I mean, there's another biblical foundation there too. So choosing the right friends might bring out the best in you. Choosing the wrong friends might bring out the worst. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's an incredibly interesting insight to explore, Neil. One of the things that I've done in my life is spend a bunch of time thinking about the nature of wisdom in the book of Proverbs. The institute that I work for, the Lachlan Macquarie Institute, its slogan is training wise leaders. And one of the things that you notice about wisdom in the book of Proverbs, and it's a little bit surprising, is that it says that your capacity to grow in wisdom is actually based on your friendships. And you just picked up some of those references, that if you run with the wrong crowd, if you are a friend of fools, you'll become a fool. And if you want to grow as a wise person, Proverbs says, then make wise friends. And so our capacity for wisdom is itself limited and enhanced by our capacity for friendship. Yeah.
And I imagine that when we're talking friendships, we want to have a variety of different depths. We're going to have those deep, unconditional friends. They're going to love us, even warts and all. But then there's going to be a spread of that friendship through the people who are going to be influenced by even our good character, if we've got good character. Any thoughts here on having this variety?
Yeah, and I think this is actually one of the things that you notice in the lives of wise people, is that they have different kinds and levels of friendship. It's not possible to have really close, deep friends in great numbers. You're probably only going to have, 3, 4, if that, of those really deep friends that are like a brother or a sister to you. But then you might, you're right, have a broader range of different kinds of friendship where you're living around some kind of shared purpose together. And this is where that idea of fellowship comes in. You share a purpose which becomes the basis of some deeper kind of connection with each other. And they can be all sorts of different kinds of things. It can be coaching a kid's sporting team together or serving on a church committee. And you can find friendships that grow up out of that soil of shared purpose.
Now, you've been reflecting on the latter chapters in the book of Acts. And we're talking about Paul here in a particularly difficult time in the Roman Empire where, it was very difficult because there was persecution of Christian believers. What have you discovered, maybe in a big picture sense, around those latter chapters in the book of Acts and what that might share with us in the idea of friendship?
Well, I've been studying and reading through those with a bit of a political lens on, because that's my job. We train people who are getting involved in the political ecosystem. And one of the things that I was really struck by is that the last third of the book of Acts happens in a very rich and chaotic political environment. Like you said, it's the context of the height of the Roman Empire, the kind of greatest extent and the greatest glory, I think, of Roman institutions. And Paul, for those chapters, after he gets arrested for allegedly causing a riot in the temple in Jerusalem, is in the Roman political world. He's put on trial before governors. He's carted around by centurions, and everything is moving towards him going to Rome to appear before Caesar. And interestingly, in those chapters, the two key moments in which God actually speaks and says what he's doing, we get lots of action from other people, but when we want to find out what God's doing, it's in two dreams that happen to Paul, where the Lord appears to Paul and says, "You must stand before Caesar." And so we know as we're reading those chapters that all the other things that are happening, and there's shipwrecks and assassination plots and trials, everything, all this crazy action is happening, but it's all going towards one purpose, which is that Paul must appear before Rome and must appear before Caesar in Rome. That's what's going to happen. What's interesting is the way that God works through all those other events. So there's, like I said, shipwrecks and assassinations, but there are also friendships and encouragements and fellowship that actually helps him to complete his task.
So some might even say, well, isn't Paul the one who had an incredibly deep revelation? And you might even talk about the Damascus Road experience, and this is the sort of thing that fires him up to be able to complete this mission that he's on. But what I can hear you reflecting on there is that he must have had these friends, who perhaps you might even say are the other apostles, who are cheering from the sidelines and in some ways communicating in whatever they were able to do in the first century. But that was also a real strength to Paul and his mission. Any thoughts here?
Absolutely. And I think we actually see that all the way through Paul's letters, and you see it in the book of Acts as well. So it's very easy, isn't it? If you're reading in the New Testament, you're reading letters of Paul, you get to the end and there's these funny little bits where he says, greet this person and greet that person. And when we see that, we think, we're at the credits now. It's like watching the movie. We can kind of stand up and leave. What we need to do is actually pay more careful attention to those sections, because what they show us is a network of people all spread out around the world who are supporting each other in mission. And it's a beautiful picture. So Paul can write, bring my scrolls to me, or I was so encouraged when you sent Epaphras to greet me in prison. In Acts, we know that he's got friends traveling with him, because Luke, who's writing the book of Acts, uses the first person plural, we were shipwrecked. And so we know that even though Paul is the one on trial and he's been arrested, people like Luke have volunteered to come along on a prison ship to be there with Paul and encourage him. And then when they finally get to Italy, we hear of a whole bunch of believers from Rome who make a journey, a multi-day journey, to come to the place where they've landed and greet them and meet them and encourage them and feed them, and then come back with them to Rome. So there's all these little networks of friendship and fellowship that are actually making it possible for Paul to do what he does. And
from what we're talking about so far, and for listeners, we're going to even take this to some steps deeper as well as our conversation goes. But for the listener right now who's saying, wow, I didn't appreciate that these friendships in the scriptures had such significance. How can I make that happen for me today? How could I be inspired in the same way that friends working together for a common mission might just be so empowered? What do we take away from some of these things for today as individuals?
Well, there's a couple of interesting things to think about there. C.S. Lewis probably wrote one of the greatest books on friendship. It's actually a section of a book that he wrote called The Four Loves. And he talks about different kinds of loves, and one of them is friendship. And he makes the point that the people who pursue friendship are often the people who are worst at it. And we all kind of have that experience at times, don't we? That the person who kind of shows up and says, I just really, really want to be your friend, that's a hard person to actually form a friendship with. The way that the Bible encourages us to grow in friendship is not by going out there and saying, I want to be your friend, but by becoming the kind of person who can be an excellent friend. And so that's growing in our own character in certain kinds of ways. But there is another thing that we can do as well, and we see this all through Scripture, which is to find a project, find a cause that God has called us to, and then gather other people around it. And it's as we work shoulder to shoulder on something that we find those bonds of friendship growing between us.
Helping you make sense of life, culture, and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. You might have your own insight into friendships and the social impact that comes from the sorts of friendships that you might even describe as godly friendships. What happens in families, in churches, in entire communities and in nations when you have friends who work together? When you've got friends under a common mission, friends who understand what it is to have relationship with God, that sort of fellowship that goes a little deeper than sometimes the way we think about friends. Well, our special guest is the Reverend Dr. Dan Anderson. He's director of the Lachlan Macquarie Institute based in Canberra. Hey, what can we draw attention to? Examples, Dan, of the sorts of friendships that might be based on these biblical understandings that we're talking about, but things that have, changed the world, changed nations. What comes to mind for you?
Well, it might be a bit surprising when you understand that I'm someone who thinks a lot about politics and tries to train people for political engagement. But I actually think friendship is one of the hidden ways in which God shapes our politics and changes our societies and our culture. And so we're often at the moment, paying a lot of attention to voting and to policies, and those things really matter. But the deep hidden structures are the networks of friends and the way that God works through them. One of the great examples of that would be the famous group, the Clapham sect. They were a group of friends who lived in England. They got their name because they all together in the little village of Clapham at the start of the 19th century. And a number of them were very involved in politics, most famously William Wilberforce, but others were involved in business. They ran lots of different organisations. But they loved the Lord Jesus. They loved each other. So they actually took the decision to buy houses near each other, to go to church together, to meet during the week with each other, to form really deep, close friendships. Lots of them ended up even marrying each other's siblings and things like that. And it was out of those relations some really significant social transformation of slavery, the institution of things, RSPCA, the prevention of changes to the laws around child employment and things like that. Social policies that came out of these friends discussing together how did the gospel come to bear on the world around them.
Interesting, isn't it, that we don't often think of things like the Clapham sect, and for any listeners who are thinking that's just a description of a group of friends that used to gather together, and they're probably sitting around, and I'm just speculating here, but maybe smoking cigars even back in those days, and they are planning something very significant. And I'm not sure whether listeners have caught, but you've actually picked up on an example there that actually shaped Australia, colonial Australia, because these were the guys who were interested in prison reform. So you had Wilberforce, who was the one who is credited with ending slavery. So now prison reform in the colonies and pointing to Australia. So the friendships that gathered around that dining room table potentially actually affected Australia and its formation and the things that shaped us right from the very beginning. That's very powerful.
It is powerful, isn't it? And another example of the way they affected us is that the reason that there was a chaplain, a Christian chaplain on the First Fleet, was that this Clapham sect lobbied the colonial secretary to make sure that happened. They weren't going to send a chaplain. And so they lobbied, made sure that there was one, and then they picked a man named Richard Johnson, and made sure that he was a really good, faithful gospel preacher. Like you say, all of that flowed out of the fact that they loved each other. They shared their lives together as friends. And then out of that, were able to support, challenge each other, think of new ideas, and then resource them together.
Now, just reflect on that and what that means for, as you say, when you're talking politics, when you're talking about nation-shaping values, you're talking about friends gathering together, and just bringing in what we were talking about a little earlier, good character shaping good friends, bad character leading in a different direction altogether. Some of our political parties, when we're talking about polar opposites, sometimes we're actually making judgments, aren't we, about whether they're good or whether they're bad based on values. Thoughts here around, our political movements that even began with these sorts of friendships?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that you will find this at the beginning of just about every great social project is a group of people coming together. Sometimes it starts with a cause and then friendships grow out of it, or sometimes it starts just with friends gathering together and then saying, hey, we should do this thing. Um, that stands at the beginning of lots of our different political parties. It also often is the goodness within any political movement. It's often there's one person who's the headliner, right, who gets a lot of media or press, but usually they have some deep friends around them, and they are, if they're politically good, in the sense of both not just effective, but people of character and conviction who are making a good difference in the world, it's usually because they have friends who encourage them and also challenge them about the way that they're living and help them to actually stay on course. So I think that's often, again, the hidden secret in our politics.
And of course, the ongoing success of ideas that are shared in common, that's not always guaranteed, is it? Because you can have the ideology of a particular friendship movement that grows into a political movement that can be hijacked down the track. So how about friendships ongoing and the development of new friendships so that values are passed on to new generations? Is this friendship so important that it actually has all sorts of ramifications for the values passed on?
That's a really interesting kind of thought, Neil. I do want to say that we live in all sorts of other kinds of relationships. Friendship isn't everything. And once a social movement grows beyond a certain number of people, it does become something more like an ideology or a society or a community. We have other kinds of words for those things, and they have their own beautiful aspects and their own dark sides. Like you say, they can become perverted and twisted in different ways. Friendship is that small scale set of relationships that helps us to drag things like community and society back to what their ultimate goals should be. They're the kind of engine of change and the kind of conscience, I think, within larger groupings like societies and communities. And so it's as friendships keep renewing themselves, and like you say, through generations, that we do pass on some of those key projects that really matter to us to other groups of people that we know deeply and can trust. And then they will have a broader impact, like you say, add on to a larger group of people, a society or a culture.
What about friendships within families? And I've got to say that, while it's probably very fresh still in listeners' minds, you've got the Trump victory in the US, and there he is on stage accepting the applause of the people, and thousands there, and all the family joins him on stage. And it's a little bit like family and friendships. Any thoughts here? Because, this whole idea of blood is thicker than water, and, family, you're stuck with your family, whether you like them or not. But family and friends, where do you sort of put in some thought around, my family being my friends? Because some people are going to say my family sometimes sounds like my worst enemies. Any thoughts here?
Yeah. That's a really interesting set of questions, and I think that's something we could unpack at a fair bit of detail. One of the things that the Bible does do is draw a distinction between the kind of relationship that you have with your friends and the kind of relationship you have with your family. It doesn't collapse them into each other. And one of the ways that it makes that distinction is that family has a set of obligations to each other that we don't choose. They're just given to us. We're born into a family, and that gives us obligations towards each other that are more than sometimes we would even want for ourselves. And that's why Proverbs can say a brother is born for adversity, because a brother, in a sense, has obligations to act towards you even when times are tough. What's different about friends is that there is a kind of voluntariness to friendship. It's something that we choose for each other in an ongoing way towards each other. There's a kind of freedom to friendship. And that makes it very special, I think, at times, because we know that these people are not here because they have to be, but because we love something together. We love each other and some cause together.
Dan, let me come back to the thought of our friendships and this other word, fellowship, because we talk about fellowship with God, fellowship with one another. Is there a confusing element here? Are fellowship and friendship the same, or does one come from the other? How do you make a differentiation, or how do you group the two together?
It's an interesting question, Neil. They do have a slight differentiation between them. The word fellowship, particularly in the way that the New Testament uses it, actually has its background in a kind of commercial partnership type arrangement. It's something where we come together to share resources with each other in order to achieve a goal. But obviously, it takes on more than that sense. It starts to have a sense of affection and love and regard for each other as well. And certainly when Paul is writing to the Philippians and giving thanks to God for their fellowship in the gospel, he's picking up both on the sense in which they are self-sacrificially giving so that he can be out there preaching, but also the way that they're praying and the way that they love each other and they send their own people over to be supporting him. So there's a dimension to fellowship which has that affectionate character to it. When we talk about friendship, I think it's got that lens more on the affectionate relationship side of the fellowship dimension. Yeah.
And fellowship with God, friendship with God. I mean, we might even reflect back to the Old Testament. Abraham, known as a friend of God. Is there anything special about that friendship terminology when God uses that, or when Jesus called his disciples friends, which wasn't early in the ministry, but later in his ministry? Any thoughts here?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about what's going on in both those contexts. In the context where Jesus refers to his disciples as friends, he's contrasting it with servants. And the contrast he draws is that friends know their master's business, or they share the purpose together and will carry it out, whereas a servant doesn't have to understand the business. He just has to do what he's told. And that's something that I think is true about Moses as well, is that he actually knows God at a kind of level of depth, and he shares God's passions and his mission. And then we're invited into that as well, to be people who actually know what God loves and then seek it together with him. And our best friendships are ones where we know what each other loves and we seek it together.
So friendship with God. If you're a believer today and you're thinking, how do I take my faith a level deeper and pursuing friendship with God? And let's all keep that in the right respectful context here. But sharing God's passions, is this one of the ways that you actually might move towards a newer, deeper maturity, just looking for what the passions of God might be and to become a partaker in those, to share those passions?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. One of the ways that we grow in friendship with each other, and I think it's the same when we're talking about God as well, is that we are deepening our sense of what he loves. And so as we reflect on his mission in Scripture, and as he speaks about his heart for the lost and for justice, it's as those things become things that we love more deeply, that we grow in a way that can be spoken of as friendship with God. That's exactly what I think Jesus is inviting his disciples into in that beautiful passage in John's Gospel.
When we think of mission, and sometimes we're scared by that word. Oh, really? I'm a Christian now, I've got to be on a mission. Sometimes we get scared by that because, that might lead us into some danger, some deeper waters. We might be out of our comfort zone. I mentioned in the introduction a little earlier when we were talking about some level of reflection on the latter chapters in the book of Acts, and Paul, who was on that missionary journey, and he was on his way to Rome and going through all of the hardships that he faced there. Do you think that he was sustained because of this friendship or these shared passions with God?
Absolutely. And again, I think the book of Philippians is probably one of the best places where you can get Paul's own account of what that meant for him. And so that he will speak of himself as full of joy because he's participating, he's sharing in Jesus' own sufferings. He sees his own life as so bound up with the life of Jesus that when he looks at his own life, he can see, I'm a prisoner in a Roman jail. That's what happened to Jesus. And I'm going to be put on trial, and that's what happened to Jesus. And it might even be that I'm going to die at the hands of a Roman governor, and that's what happened to Jesus. And if all of those things are true, then what happened to Jesus next was that he was raised from the dead and God glorified him. And that's probably what's going to happen to me as well. And so his sense of identification with Jesus is so deep that he can see it in his own biography. And he sees himself as someone who is now, he can say in Colossians, I'm not even alive anymore. It's Jesus who lives in me. And so I share his heart and his mission so deeply that that's going to take me wherever Jesus wants me to go. That's the kind of friendship and love that you see there. Yeah.
Stay with this, in-depthness for a few moments because, maybe this is something of the mystery, but We might say God chose Paul to go on that ministry mission journey, maybe because there was something special about Paul, a certain level of intelligence, a certain pain threshold that maybe he had to be able to suffer through persecutions and shipwrecks and all sorts of hardships. But will he choose me for that sort of mission? Or what sort of mission do you think God might choose me for, given that I might have a different set of, characteristics that make me the person that I am? What are your thoughts here on how God actually uses people like Paul? Is that just an individual thing, or is there something that God does en masse as he chooses his people?
What we're talking about here is God's mission before it's ours, isn't it? So we can say something about God's mission. It's that he hungers and desires for those who do not know him to be reconciled to him, and for his goodness to be tangible and obvious to the whole world. That's what we mean when we talk about God's passion for his glory. Now, that's going to look kind of the same in everyone's life, because it's always going to be about God's goodness becoming more obvious. And it's going to look different for everyone, because you're right, Paul probably did have a particular kind of intelligence and a pain threshold and a cultural background. And so when God chose him for that mission, he was choosing all of those things. And we live in very different times and places with different kinds of gifts. So when he uses us for his mission, he'll use what he's given us in terms of our culture and our background, and redeem our wounds and our scars, and take hold of those things that are our strengths. And he'll weave all of that together in his mission. So yeah, it will look unique and individual, but that's actually what's kind of special about the friendship metaphor, I think, is that friendship involves that careful attention to each other and what we love about each other, and helping each other to become uniquely what God intends us to be.
Let me ask you, because while we're into this sort of depth here and, God's passions and what he intends us to be, when I'm planted in a church, there are people that I'm connecting with. Let's say that there are friendships that are growing. Some of them might even be really quite mature friendships. But when I'm planted in a church, has God put me there, and has he already set me up with the friends that I'm supposed to work with? Someone might say, well, I need to get away from these turkeys if I'm going to soar like an eagle. I mean, what sort of attitude ought we have to the friends that we already have in our local church? What are your thoughts here about where God plants you and the friends that you already have, or the ones that you might aspire to have?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and it's not an easy question to answer in the abstract, is it, Neil? Like, we need to actually talk about each person's situation at some level of detail there. But I would say this, that God is the God who redeems things that seem broken and busted. And so if he has put us in a particular situation, our first instinct should be to be a little bit curious about what is in that situation and what God might be using that's there, to what he might transform and redeem. And it might be that some of those turkeys could be wonderful friends or people that you could have some kind of ministry to. And you might need to be curious and asking the Lord to show you how that could be the case. It might be the case that they might be foolish friends that you do not need to be a part of. Proverbs also tells us that we should flee from those kind of foolish friends. But to start with, I would say, let's be a little bit curious and ask questions about the God who is in control of all of those circumstances of our lives and gives us those kinds of things to work with. Yeah.
Dan, what are some of the characteristics you think that good friendships have? If we're making a bit of a self-assessment right now, and, I might be thinking, well, am I a good friend? Do I have good friends? What are the characteristics you can point to that actually make good friendships?
This is always a dangerous thing to do, isn't it, Neil? Because you and I are now on display, and all my friends will be listening to my answer and wondering, am I doing these things? I do think we want to say, first of all, that reiterating something I said earlier, that we want to ask these questions about, am I doing these things, as opposed to going out there and viewing them as a shopping list for the kinds of people we want to have as friends. But I would say there are three things, and I was really helped to think about these things by studying Proverbs, and a little bit by the thought of Tim Keller, who's written some good stuff on this stuff as well. I think Proverbs identifies three different characteristics of a good friend. One is their constancy, that they stick with the friendship through ups and downs. And that's that proverb that says that a friend is there for all times. And so if we're thinking about how to be a good friend, we want to think hard about, am I someone who can stick it out? And the biggest test of that is actually when your friend is hard to love or they've done something dumb, will you stay there with them, even when they're experiencing the consequences, perhaps, of their foolish action? Can you stay there with them as a constant friend?
Is friendship part of your leadership training? You know, if we're talking about LMI, the Lachlan Macquarie Institute, and there you are training a whole lot of, really capable, significantly gifted people to be able to go into the world and engage with the issues and the values of the day. And, you're training people to do that. Do you take some time to actually, do you train people in friendship? Is it something you can train for, or is it something you fall into?
You can train for it, and I think we do, but not by sitting down and running a seminar on friendship. What you do is you put people in a close circumstance with each other where they have to live with each other and observe each other's character, and you give them a strong sense of a shared purpose. And then out of that, friendship emerges, and you get to practice it. And I can tell you that the people who I think will be most successful in leadership who come out of our institute, I could predict that on the basis of how they function as friends within the institute as I see them go through it. The people who are obsessed with their own ambition or are struggling with unforgiveness, who really struggle to make good friendships, are also going to be the kinds of people that I don't think are going to be wise leaders later on.
And is this the reason why you don't just have a course and people can just sort of, come Monday to Friday? You've got a residential program with Lachlan Macquarie Institute because that live-in factor actually brings some of these things to the surface?
That's exactly right, Neil. And it's funny, every time I speak about our program, and probably even after this time with you, I'll get emails from people who are cranky at me about the fact that we don't have an online offering. Because people really would love, and it is really difficult. I appreciate that. There are people with family situations and work situations. It means that you can't take 3 months off to go and live with us in Canberra. But I'm unapologetic about the way that we do it because of those reasons. The way that we shape our character through living with each other and the friendships that we form are essential to the kinds of leaders that we want to produce.
I suspect there are listeners who are thinking, and, as you say, some will say, why isn't this just an online offering? Why can't I just earn the certificate and there I've got it? But others are going to be saying, well, I'm glad there's something that goes a little bit deeper than a certificate and actually is at that really powerful friendship level where those who are studying together graduate together and they become, as I mentioned a little earlier, you've got this sort of alumni focus where you've got lifelong friends that are formed through the courses that you run. Now, you've got one starting this Sunday, but I think it's too late for any listener to get involved in that one. But you've got one that's coming in March next year, a residential fellowship program. What would listeners need to know? And you might even like to let us in on what sort of person would that benefit most.
Absolutely, yeah. So it starts in March next year, 23rd of March, I think is the date. The correct dates will be on our website if I've got that wrong. It's a 3-month, as we've said, residential program. It's focused particularly on people who want to be involved in the political ecosystem in Australia, so maybe seeking elected office or working as a staffer or working in a think tank. But more broadly than that as well, anyone who's involved in cultural leadership. That could be working as a teacher or being a doctor or a lawyer. There's lots of different ways. Organising something in your community. Maybe you've got a great cause that you're really passionate about. So lots of people come to us who are really passionate about the pro-life movement and they're looking to be better equipped to be effective in that cause. So that might describe you. We also get sometimes people who are just trying to work out what God has for them next in life, and they need a bit of time with a community of people who are really challenging them to think deeply about that. That might describe some people as well.
Do you need some special academic standing? You've already gone and earned a degree or something like that, or what sort of people, academically, is it a really demanding academic course that you do, or how would people, think about how that might look when they're going to think about applying?
It is a academically demanding program, yes. So we run it as a postgraduate course, and there's quite a lot of reading involved. But we do certainly take people who come from non-standard academic backgrounds. So there are plenty of people out there who are very bright who just haven't been to university and have gone in a different direction. So whether or not you've got a qualification is not what matters. It's whether or not you'll be able to keep up with the work. And if you are interested in this program, then I would urge you to get in touch and we can talk with each other about that and work out together whether it would be suitable for you. But don't hold back just because you haven't got a degree.
Now, I know that your download program is primarily for young people. The residential fellowship program, is that open to all ages?
The residential fellowship program is open to all ages, but we would expect people to have finished usually some kind of university qualification. And we take people who are mostly between 25 and 35 of age. We take people outside of that as well, but that's the kind of core target. The download, which is our shorter week-long intensive program that we run with the ACL, with the Australian Christian Lobby, that's for people 18 to 25. So it's the kind of more young adult age, and that's a good taster for people if they want to find out more about these sorts of things.
But that residential fellowship program, it's actually a 3-month program. So in some sense, you've got to be able to take 3 months out of your life, which may launch you into the rest of your life. Are people concerned about that when they sign up, or is it something that they're prepared to make a sacrifice there to really, train and to become equipped to be able to change the world? Is that the sort of thing you think of?
Yeah, I think that's one of the really significant challenges for people as they think about this is that it's 3 months, and that's a hard thing to find in your life at virtually any stage of life. And so it does take, I think, a real sense of adventure and imagination. But at the same time, I have never seen anyone go through this program that God hasn't provided for richly on the other side, whether that's in terms of relationships, a deeper sense of vocation, and sometimes even moving into new kinds of fields of work. I think God honours that desire to trust him. So.
Well, I know that this time of year there'll be a whole bunch of people who are thinking, I want to do something deeper to serve God. I want to really connect with his mission. And this may be something that for listeners you can make some inquiry about and be a part of what's happening with the Lachlan Macquarie Institute. And you can hear the Reverend Dr. Dan Anderson. He's overflowing with wonderful wisdom and training Christian men and women, wise leadership, biblically faithful, culturally intelligent, positively engaged for the common good. And here's an organisation that's set up to, in fact, shape the future of our nation of Australia. You might want to be a part of that. Let me give the website where you can connect with the Lachlan Macquarie Institute, lmi.org.au, lmi.org.au. You'll get details about that residential fellowship program and also about the download for the 18 to 25s. Dan Anderson, thanks so much for taking some time to share your thoughts around these things today on 2020.
Neil, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.